Hello, welcome to the realm of ideas is free to all. I'm Bruce Gemmel, researcher, draftsman, architectural researcher, draftsman. Um, okay. Okay, this is episode 24, Truth. And this is a series of ruminations I give to kind of clarify my thoughts on the nature of my ideas. Let me give a shout out to my friends at the Spitzer School of Architecture at City College, where I spent yesterday on review in the studio of my friend Ahu, who I've interviewed on my channel. She's doing some beautiful work there, and I think that we had a really fascinating time. Had some really good discussions. We talked about some really interesting things. It pertains to the idea of preparing the architectural mind for consequences that I don't believe the architectural mind is ready for. Ho and I spoke about this when we had a kind of discussion in the New York Botanical Gardens in the Bronx. And anyway, it's been an ongoing conversation. I think she understands quite well how the fact that the architectural mind is not really completely prepared for, or actually doesn't appreciate that it may be better prepared for the consequences of becoming architectural reality, but at the same time may not understand that it needs to be able to utilize some of its buying skills in order to do that. But some of those yesterday, and it was actually quite a successful series of investigations. There were 7 sets of students, and they all did quite commendably well. This was their 5th year in their Bachelor of Architecture program. So many of these people have had their last architectural school review and were quite relieved. It was also a good panel of reviewers. It was kind of a fairly good range of individuals in terms of everything from what I would say fairly conventional architectural thinkers to kind of some people who are actually in kind of interdisciplinary kind of roles, some like myself kind of in the difference of kind of like generative strategy and kind of like kind of some of the more kind of like, abstract aspects, and then some of them kind of more and kind of closer to or further away, but all lending themselves to their great expertise. Julie was unfortunately not able to join us, but hopefully as we continue on in the studio, Ahu will have, Julie will be back. We also saw Neil Katz, our friend from SOM, who's also a professor at City and also Pratt. So it's always good to see Neil. I should probably have him on and talk to him about some of his master geometer kind of like aspects of his own work. He's a fascinating guy. I love Neil. Anyway, so where are we? Okay, so we've been talking about these various different topics, and we've kind of come through different things. We started with, what are we doing here? How did we get here? Then some things about myself in terms of like ideas that kind of formulated in my mind as I was going through my different stages of my career and my life, and then into and encouraging the way in which I developed into my work as a professor, and then afterwards, and then some of the things that kind of came about afterwards in that kind of like research period that kind of is leading up to where we have gotten now, and then some of the things that were developed from those ideas. And initially we had the journey, and then we kind of had the development of the aspects of that journey. I think there was a point where I kind of saw the way in which I was going to move through architecture, but now I'm looking back and I kind of see some of the things that I moved through, and what I came to understand, and what I kind of like came to see in terms of the things that were important to me. So anyway, last couple of things that we're talking about, basically the core of what we're talking about was, an idea of the metaphor as a generative strategy, not just as an architectural component in itself, but actually as a natural component that basically understands the kind of primacy of architecture as an endeavor. We talked about the fact that architecture is a verb and not a noun, and that occasions or kind of notes of architecture can kind of stand as kind of like symbolic of certain realities, but is really kind of not. It's not really the case. And in fact, as time goes on, I'm coming to think more and more as I kind of get into my feelings about Whitehead that architecture is more kind of a process in itself than even, and that kind of becomes specific to like some of the things that we'll be talking about. But I think that been also watching some interesting lectures, some of the Gifford lectures from a couple of years ago by a man named John Dupre, who's a kind of pretty well recognized, pretty well understood process metaphysician, and I guess also science historian. So, okay. So as we have been doing, we've gotten to have the Julie Rauer time. So let's see what, Puddle?
Yes.
What's new in Julie?
Okay, I'm standing by. I just yeah. Well,
I think we have a new drawing that we should
I just
consider
finished
successful.
a drawing today. Now let's try to get it so there's not
A lot of
a lot
glare.
of glare. How are we
Let me
doing? See if you can do that.
Okay.
Because there's so much glare. Is anyone able to see that?
Don't know.
Can you zoom in for a detail?
It's funny because the thing is, because everything's
It looks
reversed.
washed out, but it doesn't.
Ditto.
I mean, if it's not, it's very saturated and the hues are very intense. I feel like I'm gonna put it in an angle or something. I don't even know if anyone can see it.
It's not so bad.
Okay.
Ah, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, now we got it. Okay, tell us a little about it.
It is Parietal Eye Palace is the title, and this was inspired by my research on how the circadian clock affects autoimmune response in people, pretty much, and then light, which is filtered and modulated by the pineal gland in the human brain, which then controls your metabolism and, most importantly, your sleep-wake cycles, is the equivalent in certain amphibians of a parietal third eye, which happens to be on the tops of their heads, which is their circadian clock, which regulates everything, like, again, their sleep-wake cycles, their metabolism, incredibly important if you're cold-blooded. So, as am I.
Mm-hmm.
So what is very important is the piece that I wanted to use as the metaphor happens to be in the Indian wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it is a tri-lobed nephrite box. Basically, the top lifts off, and you can actually see the rim of the lids here and here. The top lifts off, and the actual handle, which is basically looks like a lotus bud, I've turned into a parietal eye. Now, I thought to myself, here's an interesting challenge. What can you find also organic, also in the natural world, that is not a literal eye, which, is something that would look more ghoulish or comical? Not that I don't love Vincent Price. He's one of my absolute favorites, but I didn't want it to be a ghoulish piece. That's not my work and not my way. There's haunting, which creeps into your soul and nests there and stays with you for the rest of your days. And then there is the ghoulish, that is, creature feature fun.
Yeah, I mean, there's
Right.
there's disturbing and disquieting,
Yeah.
which is, I think, what you're talking about. The idea
Yes.
that something is basically kind of part of an existential reality, not just a kind of shock value of like, oh my God, he jumped out of the closet.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
So I thought to myself, what has the material properties of not just a human eye, which is something the viewer would connect to, but of the parietal eye, which actually looks like a small pool of water that formed on a leaf. It's a very strange looking thing. It doesn't have a cornea that we know of. It's not, it's more a light receptor. It's a very interesting thing. And the only time it does look more like a human eye is when it's infected. I found a fascinating research photo of someone with a pet iguana who had photographed their hugely infected third parietal eye. And as you might know, in the Buddhist canon, the third eye is right here on the forehead and is usually represented by a stone or some kind of carving or some kind of mark here. So the third eye is seen as the window of enlightenment into the soul. So it's a very enigmatic, very fabled, very magical kind of thing. But in this research photo, I found it looks like a cabochon of a gem. It's bloodshot, it's bulging. Normally, the parietal eye does not bulge. In fact, it's, if you were to compare it to a wedding invitation, it is debossed script, not embossed script, meaning its magic comes in the nadir of its being, not the apex of its being. So it is basically a small pooling of water, you know, as the human eye would be extremely liquid. So what I did was I thought, what is mostly liquid? And then I thought of the opal, my birthstone too, which has refractive capabilities like the human eye, reflective capabilities, and I would say is very retinal in its compartment, that the opal may be the most retinal of stones. And it's ever changing. It, in fact, looks like it has sight, like it has second sight. It's constantly interpreting light. So it is a circadian stone, I would say. And I found 2 Australian black opals online, and that is one of those Australian black opals that I drew in as the parietal third amphibious eye. And then the spinal column and the brainstem comes down like this. And then up here with the iguana hands is the cerebellum section. And I worked from a photo of a real cross-section human cerebellum.
Yeah, talk about the correlation between the animate and inanimate aspects. Because the thing is, you have both, you know, you have a composite presence of animate, inanimate, and conscious elements. So what I saw, what I thought was quite brilliantly done, was the fact that the iguana, right, actually has these kind of like exoskeletal aspects, and then coming out of this exoskeletal aspect rises this parietal eye.
Yeah.
And it seems very much kind of like in scale, but completely surreal in its juxtaposition, which I thought was interesting, that you now substituted the same kind of like faceted elements of the jade box, and that had a stem that was very, which is what you used to kind of like extend the neurological and kind of skeletal object to kind of create the new construction.
Thank you. That's very, very well put. Did you have a question about that? Because you were
no. I mean, I just that's what I saw. I mean, I was like, you know, but I'm saying it's become this sense where, you know, these jade pieces that kind of sit very much as inanimate things have definitely developed an organic component in the fact that they're kind of like engaged now, as if that their radiance comes not simply from the light capacity that's within the jade itself, but almost from the kind of radiant aspect of its consciousness that is aligned to with the parietal eye. That makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so all right, so that's what's new in Julie.
Thank you.
Bye, P.
Hi, P.
Okay, so
and this guy can really tear through a Ukrainian tart.
That's true.
Yeah, he had a dessert
Yes, I did.
extraordinaire.
I did. Okay,
Yeah.
so basically,
Thanks, B.
we came to the last pieces. We were talking about different things in terms of unbreakable bonds, and I kind of realized that there was a kind of a uniqueness to these precipitate, or what I would say occasions or deposits, that are the that we see in terms of what Whitehead would refer to as precipitates or deposits of civilization, or kind of like indications. So I don't know if civilization is a deposit of, or truth is a deposit of the other. But what happens is truth and beauty, basically defined by here in the beginning of his piece in the Adventure of Ideas, which I've been saying we're looking at the last couple of weeks. But he says at the very beginning of Civilization, Part 4, truth and beauty are the great regulative properties in virtue in which appearance justifies itself to the immediate decision of the experienced subject. So what he means by that is these are the two things that are recognizable and identifiable. The justification determines its status in the immediate occasion. The subjective form of the prehension can include immediate emphasis on attenuation, and it can include purpose of prolongation into the future or purpose of exclusion. Truth and beauty are the ultimate grounds for emphasis and for prolongation. Of course, the present can be sacrificed to the future, so the truth and beauty in the future can be the reason for the immediate attenuation of either. But the point being that these two pieces are identifiable in terms of being present and maybe their absence indicating something in terms of civilization. But it is certainly identifiable that he kind of talks about truth in this case. Now, there was another thing that I kind of come across that also, because in the case where, in terms of the way I'd seen it illustrated to me in terms of Whitehead, because of his, I guess, concerns with the metaphysical stagnation of Kant, rather than identify the metaphysical concern in terms of substance and process from that position that Kant kind of like had laid out, he returned to a kind of a previous position that maybe kind of like was able to kind of allowing him to kind of like be able to kind of not have to concern himself with the details of this critique of Kant in order to get to the substantive metaphysics that he came to in terms of the nature of process and becoming as opposed to being. But anyway, one of the things I felt that was very clear was the fact that in the treatise on human nature, which again we've been talking about, one of the things I'm reminded of is that there was always a concern by Whitehead about inert things that became impediments, that became kind of overbearing. And he kind of talked about that specifically in Aims of Education. And he talks about other places, but Aims of Education was where I came to kind of start to understand its importance and start to understand the need to be cognizant of it. And I think that in that piece, it was also the idea that it was best to know few things, but know them well, know them deeply. So for me, I can't say that I have a great breadth of knowledge in the fact that I've devoured 1,000 books. I may have read 100, maybe 200. But the thing is, I'd say there's probably a dozen or so that I've read deeply. And by deeply mean that I've kind of like, they almost become something that I refer to on a daily basis. And I don't say that I know these books well. I just say that these books have been important to me, and they'll probably sustain my imagination and my curiosity throughout the remainder of my life. Those books I think I've talked about. I mean, Aims of Education is one, Revolt of the Masses, Adventures of the Mind, Process of Reality, Treatise of Human Nature, Origin of Species. These are things that are kind of make up the base of my intellectual experience. And as a result, when I look at things, these are kind of part of that that aspect of what is for me, important in terms of the way in which I kind of move through things. And I think it's kind of been it's been kind of quite clear in terms of when I look back at these things, I kind of keep seeing, yeah, I think that's the case. So, as he says, like, take few ideas and kind of put them in as many perspectives, as many points of view, as many different opportunities and circumstances as possible. So I think that idea is very pertinent to the way in which I kind of see these things. So anyway, Hume in book 4, right? I think it was the beginning of end of book 3 and book 4 talks about, there's a short period, a couple of pages where he talks specifically about truth. And let me see if I found it. I just found it a second ago. Now I can't seem to find it. Okay. Here it is. It's at the end of book 2, right? And he's talking about the passions, and at the end, right, he talks about of curiosity or the love of truth. And he says, this is Hume now in Treatise of Human Nature. He says, truth of two kinds, consisting of either in the discovery of the proportion of ideas considered as such, or in the conformity to our ideas of objects and their real existence. And this, I think, is important because he's talking about the fact that given the rest of what he speaks about, truth is a thing that we see. And as he says here, it's like we are not a little inattentive to turn over so many different parts of the human mind and examine it. So my passions, without talking once into the consideration that love of truth, which was the first source of all our inquiries. He makes a point of saying, I need to make time for this because it is of vital importance. And he jots down, in this case, just a few pages, in this case, 3 pages of notes. But the ideas that he writes down, and I kind of took some of these things that I thought was interesting because I saw echoes in what I saw in Whitehead. And one of them was, we never are obliged to fix our attention or exert our genius, which of all other exercises of the mind is the most pleasant and agreeable. And I think there's a kind of correlation to something that I read in Adventures of Ideas when he's talking about truth. And he says, it is more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true. And I also remember something where he talks about that in Adventures of Ideas, where he said, like, a lot of times what happens is when we have an idea, when we have an imagination, before we concern ourselves with testing it, we concern ourselves with being curious about it or having a feeling of some kind of provocation. So there seems to be some kind of inkling towards a curiosity that kind of sends us in the direction, almost like kind of an impulse or a desire. And then, of course, that makes sense when you kind of see that within the Hume's idea of kind of putting it within the passions. But anyway, truth and beauty, in terms of what Whitehead comes to see, are these kind of like deposits of civilization, or maybe they are, civilization is the deposit of a tendency towards truth and beauty. Either way, I think what happens is it certainly is, in the case of what Whitehead would probably say, it is certainly process, and certainly are things that could be recognized through occasion. However, my feeling is these two things, because of their relation, their correlation, there is certainly an unbreakable bond. So in this case, we could see that there's an unbreakable bond where, in the case of, we have a precipitate or a deposit or an accretion. No, not an accretion. We have a deposit of truth and beauty in a relation to civilization. And I think it's hard, maybe I just haven't formulated it properly as kind of like idiom, but the reality is, right, or the proposition is, that this could conceivably be an unbreakable bond, in the fact that, as we've talked about before, the unbreakable bond as a kind of like postulate allows us not just to kind of see it as a valuable thing, but also to be able to kind of look back and say, are we protecting it in the proper way? So it can become an indictment of society if we start to see a kind of malfeasance. So in this case, we come to the fact that we're kind of talking about truth in this aspect as a precipitate or deposit of civilization, or as a catalyst towards civilization, along with beauty. So let's talk about the fact that a little bit about what it might be. Now, we talked briefly about the fact that we have what we call honesty and what we call truth. And I made a point last week where I talked about the fact that one is a societal construct and one is a kind of an existential reality. I mean, one could conceivably say to themselves, I believe that what I saw was correct and I'm being honest in my appraisal. But I also made a point of saying the fact that just the way that we talk about criticism and intent, we talk about the fact that in criticism, we separate the intent from the information so we can basically focus on its value. So if I look at this and someone says, what do you see? You see 9 green dots. Actually, no, because my finger's over one of them. You see 9 green dots. I see 9 blue dots. You see 9 orange dots. I see 9 red dots. You see 9 white dots. I see 9 yellow dots. You see, right, a cube. I see a cube. You see a square. I see a square, right? But what happens is all those things are true. Now, given the multiplicity of perspective, which basically in most cases, metaphysically, we've come to kind of see that as kind of like the God's eye view in a secular idea, or even let's say in a theological idea. So Ortega talks about perspective, Whitehead talks about, point of view. And I think the case is I heavily rely on perspective, not just as a mechanism, but as an evaluator of circumstance. So there's a piece where we go back to Whitehead. He talks about this as relates to deception, but he also talks about it in terms of discernment of pattern. So he says, okay, truth is a qualification which applies to appearance alone. Reality is just itself, and it is nonsense to ask whether it is true or false. It's true, because reality as a circumstance, in terms of like our metaphysical kind of operation, we don't ask about if reality is true or false, because in order for it to be reality, it has to be true. So it's an irrelevant question in relationship to that, but it isn't in relationship to appearance. Now, again, these are the two kind of components that we kind of have set forth from the Greeks of appearance and reality. Now, in the case of the kind of Parmenides, we have these ideas of the unchangeable substance of things that kind of, and on the other hand, we have the Heraclitean view that things are all basically constantly in change, which eventually Whitehead kind of comes to see as process. So we still have these two components, right? Truth is the confirmation of appearance to reality. The confirmation may be more or less, also direct or indirect. Thus, truth is a generic quality with a variety of degrees and modes. In the law courts, the wrong species of truth may amount to perjury. For example, a portrait may be so faithful as to deceive the eye. Its very truthfulness then amounts to deception. A reflection in a mirror is at once a truthful appearance and a deceptive appearance. The smile of a hypocrite is deceptive, and that of a philanthropist may be truthful, but both of them are truly smiling. So just like in the case of the cube, we do see the same thing, right? But the idea is trying to understand its consequence and the meaning. So in terms of the fact that we believe we honestly see something, this is a separate component than is that of the truth. The truth is that which we're trying to have discovered or revealed. Now, in my time that I live, there are people who kind of want to see that kind of truth as a social construct. And other times there are people who kind of want to say that there is no such thing as discernible as truth. Now, my feeling is just like things like God or mathematics or kind of like numbers, there are certain things that are discovered and there are certain things that are invented. I don't believe we invented truth. I don't believe we invented math. There are many people who kind of say that we, in terms of did we invent this or did we discover it? Or did we invent it? Now, I don't believe we invented truth. I believe the truth was something that basically came along somewhere in between the idea of God and somewhere in between that of, say, math. Now, the things that we've understood about the patterns of numbers, and again, given the fact that like Whitehead's, is descendant of mathematicians and logicians, he comes to metaphysics with this very deep understanding of this reality. So he understands also in his background of kind of studying back into Descartes and Newton and things like this idea of the mathematical basis and the discovery of things, rather than the invention of kind of certain truths. So in his case, where he sees a kind of truth relation, he really sees this as he uses the term pattern, which I don't think is a mistake. I think in the case of what he's saying is the fact that this is actually a kind of overlap that can allow you to kind of see a correlation, much as if the way Ortega sees the overlap in the metaphor in his quote about the cypress as a ghost of a dead flame. These things kind of become transparent to each other and basically reveal a common overlap. And they distinguish between those things that are different as well as those things that are kind of in common. So in this case, we kind of see the fact that, like, my belief is there are certain phenomenological kind of constituents that are basically understandable. They're not simply social constructions if we made them up out of the sky. These things had kind of like what I said was either kind of precipitates, deposits, occasions from other things, or they are deposits from something, or they are the catalyst for something. But they don't not exist. As if like one can say that we could live in a situation where something could not exist and we could still be here, or we could not use it and it would still kind of not have an effect. So I think the deception here, sometimes lies in the difference between what we would say the difference between a kind of say a mechanism and an organism, which I don't think is a kind of minor problem or minor, kind of like oversight. Because the fact that like in the case that we have a table, the table has certain substantive realities that basically, as long as they're maintained, exist within the confines of the table. Whereas a process has to have a stable circumstance. And one kind of basically would be something that I would say would be a kind of homeostatic thing, which is it's a solid, steady state, like a table. I could put it in the attic and leave it there for 100 years and then bring it out, and it's basically the same thing. Because it can exist without doing anything, whereas an organism is something that has to constantly exist within the process of the processes that correlate to it. I mean, so it's not just a thing, but it's an integration of processes, not a collection of parts. So I think that's the kind of thing that like you see in an organism as opposed to a mechanism. But in terms of truth, it is something that I think we need to kind of say, at least within the things that we kind of recognize as important. We can't really get to the point where we start to use a circle without identifying the idea of kind of like, numbers like pi, non-repeating numbers or real numbers. We can't get to the point where we kind of have to make different classifications of numbers. We didn't create this. We found this. We discovered this as a kind of interesting thing. It's like, wait a minute, this number that we have as a result of the operation of the circle seems to repeat. It's an identifiable consequence. It's a thing, but it's not a number in the case of the whole numbers. It's something that basically it continues to expand without ever ending, which was an interesting, maybe incidental, maybe insignificant, but kind of like interesting thing to come about. But it wasn't something we made up. It was there. It was something that was it was the result of kind of playing with circles. And again, A circle might have been a circle might be a construct because we may not observe it in nature. Now, to say that we don't is basically maybe not completely true. But the thing is, it allows us to kind of like the idea that we can kind of recognize that. Just the same way with certain things in logic, these things are kind of not, if you put these things in certain correlations, you don't invent them. You find them to be the case. And you kind of start to study them as things that you can recognize in order to get a deeper understanding of the structure. Truth has this aspect in the fact that it is a kind of component of things that allow us a certain kind of consequence, a certain value. If there is no such thing as truth, then we can't possibly understand anything, because we believe and take on faith the idea that the universe is knowable. In order for it to be knowable, there have to be certain things that are true. Now, I believe that there's truth. I believe it's discernible. I believe it's difficult. I believe that you never really kind of like, it's a struggle to get it. But I think, there's certain ideological circumstances where people may kind of feel as if like that's not necessarily what is going on. Anyway, so that's where we are. So in terms of this coming to understand this, the way I came to understand truth, beauty, and love was in the course of my work. I came to think about the fact that for me, these were the three things that seemed to be important. These were the three things that I felt were kind of important to kind of look after. And we go back to a couple of weeks where we talked about conditional, and we talked about the idea of civilization and the difference between, last week we talked about the difference between, let's see, was it last week? Let me see, look at my notes. Yeah, with tradition and culture. Yes, we talked about tradition and culture, and we talked about civilization, and we talked about the fact the first invention of culture was suicide. And I kind of realized that because like our impulse to kind of do certain things to persist was overridden when we decided that that was something that we didn't necessarily have to take as a given, or would question that there were other things that would make that necessary. So the idea was, at a certain point, we say life is continuant by choice, and that created this kind of existential reality of conditions. And in that case, that's kind of part of that kind of construct. So then we started to realize that these things are the things that you strive for. For me, given the kind of back story of Western civilization and the things that make it up and where it comes from, going back to the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the various different influences that come from other places, from China, Africa, the Middle East. I see these principles, these ideas that kind of floated through the Mediterranean, Arabic worlds, Northern Africa, Arabia, Persia, Europe, towards the kind of deposits here in America, and seeing that tradition as a tradition I thought had tremendous merit, value, and I felt was worth pursuing. So as a result of that, I kind of see as if like, if there is a consequence, you can't really talk about that consequence without talking about truth, beauty, and love. And I find as the things that I study and the things that I look at and the things that I admire, the things that I try to emulate, the things I try to understand, these are always the core components. They're kind of unmistakable. When I think of the drawing of Leonardo's, of the sketch of, I think, the angel who's sitting next to the Virgin on the rocks, that to me, the eyes of that sketch, which is something that Leonardo probably did almost before, there's almost nothing on the page. And you look at this and you look at the two eyes and you look at the way those things create a character that at the one hand, there's this kind of reticence. One eye kind of seems to give this reticence of who is this that's approaching us? But at the same time, there's a kind of like, almost a kind of adventurous curiosity It's like, I want to know this person. I want to kind of love this person. I want to engage this person. But at the same time, there's a kind of recognition of who goes there. So at the same time, these two kind of like ideas are balanced, but he does it so magnificently that you have to really look at it to realize that like both eyes have a different character and they're both kind of like sending a different message, but they're composite along with the lips and with the rest of the face and the turn of the head kind of give you this idea of this kind of complexity of expression. It's magnificent. I mean, I could spend the rest of my life looking at that drawing and I probably never understand it to the degree in which Leonardo put it into the world. And it's like well over 500 years old. But when you see things like that, or I kind of listen to kind of like, certain piece of music, I'm brought to my knees. I think to myself that this is the kind of thing that makes a magnificence of our culture, of our values, that we have things like painting, we have things like architecture, we have things like music, and that the legacy of these things, almost as if you take the idea of kind of like lineages and clades. I mean, if like my understanding of the way these things are, because like you look at a lineage as the things that kind of like you're looking backwards, and clades are the idea of kind of what looking forward. And there's always this kind of hopefulness that we understand and appreciate those things that we've been fortunate enough to have as genius surrounding us. And in that case, I mean, I think that in that regard, I see these things and want to kind of exist among them. Part of the tragedy, and this is kind of a personal thought, was that I remember kind of in the 80s, I'm just kind of graduating from architectural school. I'm kind of like starting to kind of make my way as a professor, starting to move around and starting to understand specific things that are kind of coming to my mind. And I realize it's also the kind of like middle of the Cold War. Also living in the East Village in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It's also, let's see, we had AIDS, we had crack cocaine and a drug war, and we had the Cold War. So there really was this idea of like, how real was survival. And it was an interesting thing because at the same time, America had built this kind of this organized this infrastructure that was kind of quite impressive, but it was almost as if, just like ants and termites, their strength had come as a result of their ability to kind of destroy each other. And the Soviets and the Americans had kind of put themselves at this kind of like precipice where if they had been left alone in either individual case, they would have done quite well for themselves. However, they both had the ability to basically cause tremendous amount of harm to each other. So for me, there was those conditions that like I did not want to have any part of being in bomb shelters or kind of like being a survivalist, and I still don't. And again, so when in the 1990s, when the Berlin Wall fell, and it seemed as if this Cold War had passed, and the idea of nuclear annihilation seemed less likely, though it was never unlikely. It seemed as if there was a certain sense of, hey, maybe now humanity can understand that its value is greater served by actually finding a way to put its genius behind those things that are civilization. So in terms of an indictment of humanity, right, we saw the opportunity at that point to say, okay, maybe the Cold War was a kind of mistake of the confusion of the Second World War and the atrocities that we saw and the circumstance that were kind of undeniable and certain realities that basically had to kind of go a certain way. And then we kind of found ourselves that we kind of caused a bigger problem by the end of the Second World War than when we started it. But at the same time, there were certain advantages, certain disadvantages. But the reality was, now what do we do about it? And I thought, okay, couldn't help ourselves. So the Cold War was inevitable as a result of, I'd say, reality being bigger than we were capable of understanding, which was, again, goes back to something that Ortega talked about, in The Revolt of the Masses, which is if you do not understand your particular destiny and you don't work within the consequences of that in that kind of drama, what he would call, that dramatic circumstance, you will kind of bear the brunt of it. And we did. So was it something we were prepared for? Could we have basically done a better job? Probably. But the thing is, when I look back in history, it seems like we're doing our best just to try to understand what happened rather than understanding if we had the ability to engineer a better solution. Now, that's the people who are kind of being genuine in their assessments. There are the people who are basically just trying to use it for all kind of like nefarious, reasons. And I kind of don't want to entertain that, that or those people, because it's not worth my time. But as a result, we come to this situation where we have a certain consequence that we want to kind of continue. But the question was, as we've gotten to the point we're at now, was this another slippage, or is this a coincidence, or are we basically that we will never ever abandon this nefarious, vindictive, bitter, cruel part of ourselves to just engage in genius? And that to me is a really perplexing question, because at the moment I can't say I'm hopeful about the solution to that problem. I don't have the faith in people that I once had. And I don't know if I have reason to be hopeful about the bitterness, vindictiveness, and cruelty that I see. Now, I remember that when, I think I've mentioned this before, when Ortega talked about the fact that in the end, in his summation of the Revolt of the Masses, he felt that democracy was the culprit. And I felt, America as a nation did create democracy, and it had a tremendous positive effect on society and civilization in its best forms. And in terms of America's nefarious imperialism and some of these other things, those weren't the result of those positive aspects. It was more that kind of result of that, what I was talking about before, that, that cruel, bitter, vindictive aspect that kind of served individuals. So that idea where an individual would basically be self-serving to the point where they would basically ruin something that almost would bring down the house. When I saw the 2008 banking scandal, I thought to myself, these were people who were completely unconcerned for the consequences that they wrought on society, and we pretty much forgave them. I then saw a situation where we'll figure this out in probably the future. What exactly was our knowledge? What was our complicity in some of these unanswered questions of COVID? So what did we know? What did we understand? What did we pretend to hide from people? Now, again, there are certain things that people don't need to know or aren't good for everyone to know because of the fact that they're incredibly sensitive, incredibly volatile. I don't believe that was the case with COVID. I think that there were people who, covered things up that we needed to know. So when I see a lot of things that go on, I kind of wonder to myself, like, what are the conditions? And the major question is, also as Ortega talks about, is that, there's the ability to kind of understand the destiny of your generation and put yourself to work in terms of understanding how you can benefit and use that as an opportunity, or kind of like not understand it and fall prey to it. Then there's the idea that I come to is that there are people who understand this deep organizational capacity of our society and understand the necessity for its maintenance. So there's points where sometimes we make mistakes in terms of how we operate the ship. But then there's the concern is, have we become too oblivious to our own self-serving natures where we've forgotten how to operate the ship? And one of the things that was troubling to me was I looked at the circumstances that just happened in Los Angeles regarding the fires. And I think that the obsession with certain concerns that are secondary to infrastructural operation seemed to have taken a priority where we forgot to put gas in the car. We forgot to put air in the tires. We forgot to, check the carburetor and change the filters. We got to the point where we didn't understand that these things don't fix themselves. We had an infrastructural catastrophe that we put on ourselves while we weren't even paying attention or even aware that such a thing exists. To me, that's a problem. And I'm glad that it wasn't as severe as it could have been, because from what people have told me, this could have been a lot worse in terms of what it turned out to be. It was bad, but maybe hopefully what we've realized is, hey, we can't be oblivious about infrastructure. Anyway, we've gotten kind of like through maybe an example of the illustration of this idea without really clarifying the idea in terms of what it is. But for me, the existential reality of truth is brought home in statements like this, which I kind of love. Poincaré points out that instruments of precision used unseasonably may hinder the advance of science. For example, if Newton's imagination had been dominated by the errors in Kepler's laws as disclosed by modern observation, the world might still be waiting for the law of gravitation. The truth must be seasonable. And in that, what he's saying, especially thinking about this in the context of big data and the idea of kind of like information, is understand, like he says, if one can only count to 10, one thinks of those numbers with a grander importance than they actually have. So sometimes the instruments are so finely tuned that they can be deceiving in terms of their own biases as projections. And as a result, we kind of hinder our own imagination. So I think that's why we kind of have to also, in terms of it may seem irresponsible, but always think about that idea, that an idea needs to be interesting, because I think there's a kind of correlation between that. There's something in that we need to kind of understand. We need to say, hey, is this true or not? Right? Why do we want to know? I think that there's a certain impulse, there's a certain interest, there's an intrigue in that. There's a certain, like, why do we want to know certain things when we want to know them? So anyway, that's a kind of a bit of an understanding of this idea of truth. Next week, we'll talk about beauty, which is another one of these things, and I'll think more about this idea of which comes. Is it the persistence of seeing truth and beauty in their pursuit that brings us towards the idea that kind of precipitates the civilization, or does civilization kind of precipitate the desire more likely for truth and beauty? And in my case, I also add love, because I feel as if that is the piece that kind of correlates. Again, I'm not capable of a critique of Whitehead's ideas, but I would feel as if, like, the idea of love as that which is the correlate of these two things may in fact be the piece that maybe wasn't specified grandly enough. So that's where we are. And coming up, we have, let's see, next week we have beauty. The week after that, we have love. And then what happens is I'm going to start to talk about certain things in my work. And there's certain things that I'll also come back to. I'm going to go back to this idea of Poincaré. But I'm going to talk about entanglement and conditions. And then I believe I'm going to talk about measurement, because that's also something that are the two kind of like pieces that I see within myself in terms of my own expressions. I feel that quote to heart, in the fact that these things are very much the things that trouble me in terms of those deceptions, the way in which kind of like Whitehead talks about it. And let's kind of like read that one more time because I think it's really important. Poincaré points out, let me go a little bit back further. For example, the savage who can only count to the 10 enormously exaggerates the importance of the small numbers, and so do we whose imaginations fail when we come to millions. I think that's the kind of point he's trying to make. So when he says, Poincaré points out that instruments of precision used unseasonably may hinder the advance of science. For example, if Newton's imagination had been dominated by the errors in Kepler's law as disclosed by modern observation, meaning the tools, the world might still be waiting for the laws of gravitation. So again, our biases in terms of the information and the tools that we use, if we had not seen them in the proper consequence, we may have been deceived and basically kind of hindered our imagination from looking for certain solutions. That to me is an incredibly beautiful existential horror. And I see so many times in society where those things become quiet and just absolutely diabolically evil. So for me, that aspect is indifference to the idea of entanglement and conditioning. Entanglement and conditioning is kind of like a natural circumstance that just works as if it is working completely on its own. I mean, it doesn't have the kind of moral fixation that I see in measurement. So in that case, I'm kind of looking forward to kind of fleshing those things out. But first, we'll talk through these kind of components of truth, beauty, and love, and then we'll go into like entanglement and conditioning and then measurement. All right. So that's it for me for now. It's been a good week and things are going well. So let's just close with the usual. The realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain this. Thank you.